So we're on the topic of the Yemos Mashiach and the fact that the Yemos Mashiach went into Golus. And that's the third Tekufa in human history. You know, the first 2,000 years is considered Tohu, with the Midas Adin is Sholeit. The next 2,000 years is Torah, where Klal Yisrael can have a guarantee of Eretz Yisrael and Olam Haba by keeping the Taryag mitzvahs, which contain not only performance mitzvahs, but it contains also rehabilitation mitzvahs, as we've explained. And then finally, the third period of the world is Yemos Mashiach, and what that means that the Yemos Mashiach comes to the world potentially because the Nun, the 50th gate, descends to the world and becomes available to all of Klal Yisrael. So we have the 50th gate, but we can't use it because the 50th gate and the possibility of the Yemos Mashiach has gone into Golus. So we are now in the last 2,000 years of human history in a state of Golus. And what's in the state of Golus is not so much the Jews, but the entire Tekufa of the Yemos Mashiach is in Golus. And I've been explaining this, the concept of Golus, that under the last 2,000 years we have seen Esau, the Esau, become the Mamlechas Kohanim of the world. So this is one aspect, a major aspect of the fact that the Yemos Mashiach is in Golus. Now I'd like to talk about another aspect, and so on. So today I'm going to speak about something entirely different. Okay, so let's begin to review this concept. At first, the Zulasai was in a state called the Ben Noach. Well, even before that, it was Adam Arishan, Koydem Achet. But after this, the second phase was called the Ben Noach, where the people, the Zulasai, was obligated to 7 mitzvahs. And these were the mitzvahs which were given to Noach and to Adam after the sin. And then when the people, Zulosai, in the state of Ben Noach, did not fulfill their responsibility, there were 2 generations that followed from that. There's the generation of the Dor HaMabul, the generation of the flood. There were 10 generations, and all of them died at the end through the flood. And there was the Dor HaFloga, the generation of the division, where suddenly they divided all the languages because they rebelled against God by making a tower in the form of some kind of avodah zarah, where they tried to dominate the spiritual realm. In any case, God came to Avraham Avinu and he made a bris with him. He made a covenant. And that covenant created the concept of a guarantee. That covenant incorporated the Jews as a people, and it had 3 components. First of all, there was the component of Klal Yisrael, that from now on, everyone descended from Avraham Avinu, or at least through Yitzhak, would become what's called a Yisrael, a Jew. And he would have a certain Kedusha, that he would be able to activate the sensitivity of the 613 mitzvahs, the Taryag mitzvahs, and by doing that, suddenly be able to corner the power to create Olam Haba. Not only that, but the Taryag mitzvahs not only allowed him the power to create Olam Haba eventually, through Zichuk HaGuf, through the purification of the body, but it also rehabilitated him if he would sin. So therefore, in a certain way, that's what Chazal mean by Yisrael, Afa B'Shachota Yisraelu, that a Jew, even though he sins, he's still considered Jewish. In other words, a Jew cannot resign from being Jewish. It's impossible. Even a Jew who converts to Christianity is still a Jew, except that it's a very big hate. So in any case, a Jew was guaranteed to get to Olam Haba, and therefore it would be very difficult for a Jew not to make it on some level. The Jews were allowed to descend to many madregas, many levels, to acquire Olam Haba. So the second thing that the Jewish people had a component was called the Tayag Mitzvahs. The first thing that all the descendants from Avram Avinu through Yitzhak would be called Yisrael or Jews, and they will be the subject of the covenant. The second thing was that the Jew was given 630 commandments through the Chamisha Chumshe Torah, through the Torah that was given to Moshe Rabbeinu by God at Sinai. So he would have 630 commandments in order to masaken the problem of Nam Neksufa. By admitting the sovereignty of God and the unity of God, he would masaken the Inyan, the subject of Nam Neksufa, which was the ability of a Zulasoi to see God as a you, and therefore to see yourself outside of God in a way. And the Zulasoi had to fix that problem, and suddenly realized that God was him. God says in Olam Haba, I am you. In other words, I am the foundation of your self-awareness, and therefore I am you in essence, and so on. And the Jew had to acquire this achdus with God. But finally, there was also a third component, which is promised Avram Avinu, and which never before had a certain significance. And that was the component of Eretz Yisrael, that God tied the destiny of the Jewish people to the land of Israel. That the land of Israel would have a special significance in that it belonged to the Jews and would never be taken away, although there have been many attempts to take it away. But it is a land, is an area, a geographical area, which is completely contained, it's completely connected to the Jewish people as a spiritual entity. And what do I mean by a spiritual entity? This is exactly the concept that Eretz Yisrael is the land of the Jews. But the main thing is that the spiritual connection to the Jew is the Tayag Mitzvahs. So the question is, why is it so important that the Jewish people should be attached to a certain land? Eretz Yisrael. Why is Eretz Yisrael so relevant to the Jewish people? Why should a geographical area where the Jews live be so critical to the essence of a Jew? It doesn't make a difference. I mean, the Jews are Jews whether in Eretz Yisrael or they're in America or any place in the world. A Jew is identified by the Tayag Mitzvahs, by the 630 commandments. So what's the special thing to Eretz Yisrael that the Jew in the end has to live in Eretz Yisrael? And that's where the final Yemos Mashiach will be. What is the significance of this concept? And the truth of the matter is, this concept is a very critical idea. Why? Now, when the Torah describes Eretz Yisrael, it says that if the Jews begin to worship idols, it says that the land will vomit them out. The hockey, it will vomit them out, and they will be put in exile. So it speaks about Eretz Yisrael as if it's able to perform the function of vomiting. Now, vomiting is a biological function of a living being. In other words, if something which is alive eats something which is fundamentally toxic or something like that, then the person responds by being able to reverse the peristalsis, the movement of his esophagus, so that it vomits everything out of the stomach. It's the reverse motion of eating. Eating is when you take something in your mouth and you swallow it, and it goes down your esophagus, and it travels through the esophagus into the stomach. And this, I think, is called peristalsis. But when you vomit, you're reversing that motion where the esophagus suddenly vomits. It moves upward. It pushes the food upward so that it exits the mouth. So it's a biological function. It's only something which can be done by a living thing. So what does it mean that it says that the Jews worship idols and become an unholy people, that the land of Israel will perform the function of vomiting? It will throw the Jews out of the country. How is that possible? Eretz Yisrael fundamentally is a geographical location. And geographical location or land on the planet Earth is completely inanimate. So how is it possible for the land of Israel to vomit? So we see from this that what the land of Israel is, it's not that simple. The land of Israel, in a certain way, has a life form. It's not something you could distinguish by seeing it. But the Torah considers the land of Israel as a living entity, so that it can only tolerate the Jewish people who belong to it if they observe the Torah. And if the Jews don't observe the Torah, then the land in its own way is sensitive to that infraction and those transgressions. And suddenly it sponsors the activity of putting the Jews in Golus, in exile, in some mysterious way. So therefore the land of Israel is considered in some way alive and sensitive to the stature of the Jews in Israel. Now how is it life form? What does it mean that the land of Israel is alive? All of the lands of the planet Earth are inanimate. They're just land, geographical locations. They are not alive in a certain way. But Eretz Yisrael is considered to be alive. So the question is, how is that alive? Well, there are many mitzvahs in the Torah which are called Teluyos Ba'oretz. They're connected to the land, and they can only be done in the land of Israel. For example, the Kufas, the eras that have to do with Shmita. Shmita is one of the Tayyig mitzvahs, one of the 613 mitzvahs, that on the 7th year in a cycle of every 7 years, and in the 7th year of that cycle, you're not allowed to do any agricultural work. That's right. The land has to rest. Well, that's somewhat similar to the Shabbos. Just like the Jews work 6 days, and on the 7th day they rest, it's not really resting. They preoccupy themselves with spiritual endeavors. So the land of Israel. In the 7th year, you're not supposed to work on it agriculturally. Right. So therefore, the land of Israel has a Shabbos, which is called the Shmita. It's the 7th year of the cycle. And after 7 of such cycles, which is the 49th year, and the 50th year of the cycle is called, it's called the Yovel. The Yovel is the 50th year, and there are certain laws or certain halachas that occur in the 50th year that relate to avodim, relate to workers, and relate to different things and so on. So there's a certain time cycle in the land of Israel where it relates to the agricultural efforts on the land. And on the 7th year, you're not allowed to work the land. You have to allow the land to be fallow, to replenish itself for 1 year. Well, and the question really is, well, if the Jews keep the Shmita and they don't work on the 7th year, and that's a full year, so how will they eat? Especially in the times when the land of Israel was an agricultural community. When basically Klal Yisrael was composed of farmers, agricultural efforts were the main ways they had food. Well, if you leave the land fallow so you don't work it for a whole year, How are you supposed to eat? So what God says, don't worry about it. I will give you on the 6th year double the amount of food that you will get in any single year. So therefore you will have enough food, not only for the 6th year, you will have enough food for the 7th year. In other words, I will give you a double portion in the land on the 6th year so that you will have an extra year full, completely full of food. Now, this is a miracle. This is impossible. This is miraculous that a year, in the 6th year, it produces double the food that normally it does. So that means that every 7th year, the land becomes miraculous. Or I should say every 6th year, the land is miraculous because it gives double amount of produce so that you can eat in the 6th year and in the 7th year. Clearly this is a miracle. And this is what God said. You will survive the Shmita. How? You will survive the Shmita because the land is really miraculous. It's alive. And it will be able to deliver double the portion of food that you take in every year so that you can survive for the 7th year. And the amazing thing is, we do not find in all of Jewish history that the Jews who kept Shmita complained about lack of food. That's right. I mean, God was actually saying, how do you know that I'm giving you the Torah and the mitzvahs and so on? You will see it with your eyes because the Shmita is actually a visible nace. That's right. Every 7 years, God reveals his power and gives the double portion to the Jews so that they can survive in the 7th year. So that means that Klal Yisrael lived historically for thousands of years with the concept of Shmita. And you never see in all of the history that they said that suddenly they were starving. There's no record of a famine in Jewish history, even though the Jews kept the Shmita. And therefore, this was a visible nace. It was the halacha, the mitzvah of Shmita is a visible nace. It's a miracle, an open miracle. And there are many other halachas, for example, of the land, that the land will also be, from the land would have to be taken the food for the Kohanim and the Leviim, Trumas for the Kohanim, and Maisvus for the Leviim. You see it. So there were many different halachas that had to do with the land. And there were certain issues where certain mitzvahs can only be performed in Israel, and they cannot be performed outside. You see it. So this was another thing. So therefore we see that the land of Israel is part and parcel of the Taryag mitzvahs. It's not simply a land in which you live in, a land in which you occupy, which is true of all the other geographical locations on earth and all the other lands of all the nations of the world, but it is a very special land which participates in the spiritual essence of a Jewish person. It is a necessary land. The land is necessary to perform certain mitzvahs in the Torah. So therefore, Eretz Yisrael is the third component to the Jew. The three components are the Jew, the 613 commandments, and the land of Israel. And all three of these entities are tied together so that the Jew can resaken Naman Sufa and transform the physical universe into Olam Haba, which is beyond time and beyond space. So Eretz Yisrael is a critical component of the Jewish experience. It's a critical component of the Jewish power. It's part of the Jewish power. And why is this? What is the significance of Eretz Yisrael in the sense that it relates to Jewish power? So when you ask this of most people don't know. Why is God so makpid, so sensitive to the land of Israel? Why is he so, in a certain sense, why is he obsessed with the land of Israel? Why did he designate the land of Israel as a special place where the temple would stand on the Haba, the Temple Mount, which stands in the land of Israel in the city of Jerusalem? Why is it? What is the significance of the land of Israel that it says Ki Mitzion Teitze Torah, that the Nun Sharabina in the time of the Mashiach would emanate from where? It would emanate from Zion, which is what? Which is Yerushalayim, or the land of Israel, when the Shechina returns to the land of Israel. Zion is really the land of Israel when it will be occupied by the Shechina. That's right. When the Beis HaMikdash returns and the Shechina again occupies the land of Israel, not that it left, it now does occupy the land of Israel in terms of the Kosel Ma'aravi, the western wall. The Shechina is located on the western wall. But when the Shechina inhabits the land of Israel in its entirety, it says, Ki mitzion teitze Torah devar Hashem Yerushalayim. So Eretz Yisrael is connected very much to the Torah, to the sanctity of the Torah and the power of the Torah. In what way? And you don't really see anyone speaking about this and so on. But in my mind, I have a clear answer. Because when the world turns and becomes an Olam Haba, when it becomes the future, when the physical universe converts to a sense of turning into Olam Haba, the future world, time dissolves and space dissolves. We will live without time, without a past, present, and future. And therefore we will exist forever, which is beyond time. And this will be on the planet Earth. We will be living in a certain sense on the planet Earth. But the planet Earth will not be a planetary body like it is now. It will be a heavenly body. It will be a heavenly location, which completely contravenes the laws of physics, chemistry, and biology. And what does Eretz Yisrael have to do? Well, since Olam Haba will be occupied on the planet Earth itself, it is the planet Earth which will transform to become from Olam Hazeh, this physical world, to Olam Haba, the future world. That's right. So that means that the whole transformation called Zichuch, in the creation of Olam Haba, a spiritual world, will fundamentally be somewhat on the planet Earth. And where will it start? Where does the transformation actually start? Where does the transformation of Olam Haba begin on the planet Earth? And the answer is Eretz Yisrael. That's right. The Harabayas, the Temple Mount, by the Evan Shasiya, the stone which is in the center of the Kodesh HaKadoshim, the Holy of Holies, which contains the Ark of the Covenant. That is the first place that will begin to transform in some miraculous way to become Olam Haba. So that is the significance of Eretz Yisrael. And from Eretz Yisrael starts the whole process, and it gradually goes to all the locations on the earth. So the entire earth will become Olam Haba, starting from Eretz Yisrael. And therefore, Eretz Yisrael has to have a certain kedusha in this process. It has to be a part of the halachas of Kaddish, or the laws of the Jewish people, when they do the mitzvahs. And when the Jews do the mitzvahs of Shmita and Matnas Kahuna and everything, which they take from the land of Israel, that gives the land of Israel a certain kedusha, a holiness status, so that eventually that status will give the power to the land of Israel to convert and become the entity of Olam Haba. So now we understand the importance of Eretz Yisrael. Why does God say that the Jews will one day return to Eretz Yisrael? That the Yemos Mashiach will be only in Eretz Yisrael? Why? What is it about the land of Israel? And the answer is, because the land of Israel will become Olam Haba. It is through the transformation of the land of Israel, Eretz Yisrael, that the transformation to Olam Haba from Olam Hazeh will happen. And that's why Eretz Yisrael is part and parcel of the mitzvahs, of the Taig mitzvahs. It's included in the mitzvahs themselves. So now we understand all the three components of the Judaism. The first component is the Yisrael. Every Jew is called the Yisrael because he has the power to convert Olam Hazeh into Olam Haba, and that's the definition of a Jew. You know, when you ask the people, what's the definition of a Jew? You know, they say a Jew is somebody who keeps the Torah, the mitzvahs, and that's true. But that's not the definition of a Jew. That's not the essence of a Jew. That just tells me what a Jew has to do. But it doesn't tell me what a Jew is. What is a Jew to God? And the answer is, the Jew is the individual, the Zulasoi, who by doing mitzvahs that God gives him has the power to transform the reality of the universe from Olam Hazeh, from a physical universe in time and space, to Olam Haba, to a heavenly universe beyond time and space. A Jew is nothing more than a power to do these things. And he's the only one who can do these things. And that was the covenant of Avraham Avinu, of Abraham, that he would be descended from him of people who would have this. But they were different than all the people before, because every person before Abraham, Avraham Avinu, who was a Ben Noach, also had this power. But the difference between them is that the Jew has this power and is guaranteed in this power. He will not lose it. It's extremely difficult for a Jew to lose the ability to create Olam Haba. Whereas before the Bris Ben Absalom, before the covenant with Avraham Avinu, the people, all the people of those two generations of the Dor HaMabul and the Dor HaFloga were able to lose Olam Haba. And that's the concept of a goy. A goy is a person who's a non-Jew. It means he does not have the power to make Olam Haba. He lives only in Olam Hazeh. And it's only for the Jew who is guaranteed to continue that power that can actually create Olam Haba. So the goy needs the Jew as the gatekeeper. The Jew will create Olam Haba. He has a spirituality which can create Olam Haba, and the goy can then reside in Olam Haba. But he does not have the power to create Olam Haba. Only the Jew has, and it's very difficult for the Jew to lose that power. So now we begin to understand the essence of the Jewish people, and the essence of the Taig mitzvahs, and the essence of Eretz Yisrael. Now, this is an introduction. Again, we now understand more clearly the concept of what a Jew is. But now let's get back to the original topic where we were talking about the Yemos Mashiach, when the Mashiach comes. And what we said that the last 2,000 years, the Yemos Mashiach itself goes into exile. In other words, the Yemos Mashiach actually happened with Rabbi Akiva ben Yosef, who lived 2,000 years ago. He was the first, well, not the first, but he was the person who actually had the power of the 50th gate. Therefore, he had the messianic power to engage the Jewish people and bring the redemption. But the Jewish people lost that power in a certain sense, temporarily, and the Yemos Mashiach, the days of the Mashiach, itself went into exile. So now we actually live in the Yemos Mashiach. You see it, except that we are not experiencing it in a pure, holy way. We are experiencing it in exile. That's right. For the last 2,000 years, we have been in the Yemos Mashiach. We have been. And even though Rabbi Akiva died with the 10 martyrs, with the other 9 martyrs, nevertheless, the Yemos Mashiach has already begun and is actually going on in front of our eyes. In front of our eyes. It's actually happening now. And I'm going to prove this by discussing exactly how it's happening now. So therefore, when it says that the Yemos Mashiach went into exile, what does that mean? It means that all 3 components of what a Jew is, that a Jew is a Yisrael who has the power to make Olam Haba, that the Jew has to observe Tayag Mitzvahs, the Torah, and that the Jew has to live in Eretz Yisrael. All these three components that identifies a Jew as a power Jew went into exile also. That's what it means. The Yemotzi Mashiach in exile refers to these three components in exile. That's what it means. Yisrael went into exile, the Jew. The Tayag Mitzvahs went into exile. And finally, Eretz Yisrael went into exile. That's right. The exile, which means that suddenly all of these three things were distorted and completely distorted, so they're no longer recognizable. But all of these three components, the Jew, the Torah, and Eretz Yisrael, all three of them are in exile. And we have to understand what that means. Well, we can understand what that means, that what? That the Torah, that the Torah is in exile. In order to explain that exactly, I will have to come on to another share, because this is a very deep concept. And the fact that the Jew is in exile means what? The Jew no longer is in the category of Mamlechas Kohanim. He is no longer in the category of someone who will bring the redemption. He will bring the knowledge of God to the world like the waters cover the sea. So another nation will have that chance. Who is that? Well, that's the nation of Esau, coming from Esau. That's Christianity. Christianity has been chosen, which is fundamentally in exile totally. Christianity is a mamzer form of Judaism, but they teach, in certain sense, certain Torah concepts of the world. So they are the current Mamlechas Kohanim that are destined to bring Torah information to all the goyim in the world. That's right. And I've been giving these lectures for the last couple of weeks to explain this. So the Jew himself is in exile. In exile meaning that his status as a Mamlechas Kohen, as a nation, a kingdom of priests, is in exile. You see it. Because he's not teaching the world the thoughts of Torah. He's teaching the world the thoughts of Torah through Christianity. Because Christianity contains in it many of the concepts of Torah and so on and so forth, as I've explained before. So therefore, the Jew is an indirect messenger of God, and the Christians are a direct messenger of God. They have no Kedusha, because it's considered for the Jew a form of idol worship. But yet, they still teach Torah concepts to all the nations of the world. In that sense, the Jew is in exile. He has lost the status of a Mamlechas Kohanim. Now, we've also said that the Torah is in exile. To explain this, I will have to explain next week and the following weeks. What does that mean? That's a very deep concept, that the Torah is in exile. Most Jews have no idea that the Torah is in exile. And believe me, they have somewhat of an idea, because most Jews know that the temple was destroyed, Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, and there are many mitzvahs which are no longer applicable or observable, like all the mitzvahs that have to do with the temple, all the sacrifices of the temple, and all the mitzvahs that have to do with Kohanim and Matnas Kona. All of these mitzvahs are no longer functional. We don't have them anymore because the temple was destroyed. So we know that the Torah is in exile because many of the mitzvahs of the Torah are no longer functional. They are no longer applicable. So that's what most Jews think, that the Tayig mitzvahs being in Golus and exile means that at least half of those mitzvahs are no longer functional. But that's not what the Torah in exile means. No, it doesn't. That's a big mistake. That's only one aspect of the Torah, that some of the laws are no longer functional. But what does it mean that the Torah is in exile? This is a completely different concept. And this concept is really vastly unknown, and I will explain this concept next time and so on and so forth to explain this. But what I want to do today is I want to explain the concept that Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, is in exile. That's right. The land of Israel is the third component of the spirituality, the spiritual power of the Jew. And just like the Jew has to go into exile, just like the Tayig mitzvahs have to go into exile, you see, in the Yemotzi Mashiach, so the land of Israel. But the question is, how does the land of Israel go into exile? It can't move. The Jew can be exiled to another foreign country. So when the Jew goes to America, it's said that the Jew is in exile. But how do you put in exile a land? A land is fixed, it's static, it stays where it is, and therefore it cannot go into exile. So what does it mean that Eretz Yisrael goes into exile? So we would think that what it means is that everyone is taken out of the land of Israel. All the Jews that used to live in the land of Israel in biblical times are no longer there. They are distributed throughout the world, throughout the planet, especially in the Western civilization. Most of the Jews in the world are in the lands of Europe, in certain the Arab lands, and in America and Western civilization, and only on a minor level in Africa and Asia and the South Pacific. But fundamentally, the Jews are not anymore in the land of Israel. At least they were out of the land of Israel for the past 2,000 years. Now they have returned, that's true. The Jews have come back to the land of Israel, but that's not the exile. That refers to the concept of kibbutz goliath, the return of the exiles. So now we are seeing somewhat that the Yemot Mashiach is leaving exile, but I'm not going to speak about this until a little bit later on. But for most of the last 2,000 years, the Jews were in exile, and therefore the land of Israel was uninhabited. That's right. There were really no Jews there, and so on. So does that mean that the land of Eretz Yisrael is in exile when there are no Jews? Well, at a certain level it does, but not really. So what does it mean that the land of Israel is in exile? So the answer is that the land of Israel is in exile when it is occupied by another foreign nation. That's right. When a foreign nation controls the occupation of the land of Israel, it's another nation. When that nation controls the land of Israel, when that nation lives in the land of Israel, then it's taking the place of Jews. In that case, all the mitzvahs that are associated with the land cannot be performed, not because all the Jews are missing. No, it's because there is another nation which occupies the land of Israel, and this nation does not keep the Torah. This is a Goyish nation. So therefore, the exile of the land of Israel is performed by suddenly occupying Israel with a foreign nation. Now, who is that? Well, that's interesting. Fundamentally, the nation that took over the job of Matnas Kahuna, of Mamlechus Kohanim, a kingdom of priests, was who? Well, it was the Romans. The Romans, and therefore later on the Christians that became the Mamlechus Kohanim, that was originally the purpose of the Jew. So since the Jew occupied the land of Israel, who took over? You see it. So the answer is the Christians are considered the land of Esau, the brother of Yaakov. Which nation took over the occupation of the land of Israel? And that was the half-brother of Yitzhak, Ishmael. And Ishmael fundamentally comes from the Egyptians or the Arab people, the Arab peoples. The Arab peoples and certain of these nations took over the land of Israel. And they took over the land of Israel not simply by they occupied it. No, it's not. It's much deeper than that. Because the Arabs who now possess, who used to possess the land of Israel before 1948, but we're talking about the 2,000 years before 1948, when fundamentally Arabs possessed the land of Israel. And how? They did not possess the land of Israel in simply the fact that they lived in it, but they felt that the land of Israel was their spiritual foundation. They believed that their prophet Muhammad died in the land of Israel, or that he went up to heaven through the Kessin Ma'aravi, the Western Wall. That's right. They considered the Western Wall or the Temple Mount holy. That's right. Well, how could they consider it holy? They didn't have a temple there, because what made it holy was that Muhammad, went on his horse, and when he died, he went up to heaven through the Temple Mount. He did not go to the land of Israel. He did not go to heaven through Saudi Arabia and through Saudi Arabia and the temple of the Muslims, through the Kaaba, the temple of the Muslims, which is in Saudi Arabia. But he went to heaven through the Temple Mount. Now, because they believe that, and of course it's a myth. It's a myth that was created by someone, by them, and so on. But they created this myth, but they attached this myth to a religious significance. So therefore, they believe that they are entitled to the land of Israel by God. Because why would God have Muhammad come to heaven through the Temple Mount? Only because the Arabs obviously also have a claim to the Temple Mount. Now, this is ridiculous. The Arabs have no historical claim to the Temple Mount, nor anything in the land of Israel. But because they created this myth that Muhammad went to heaven through the Temple Mount, therefore they have a claim to the land. They have a spiritual claim to the land. So therefore, now we understand what the exile of the land of Israel. It's first of all, it is not when the Jews are simply expelled from the land. That does not create a golus of Eretz Yisrael. What creates a golus of Eretz Yisrael is when a foreign country comes into the land of Israel and claims the land of Israel as its spiritual foundation. That's right. And the only one who did that is who? Is the Arabs. And they did this through the creation of the religion called Islam. So the whole purpose that God allowed Islam to be created, and the Muhammad, who they considered a prophet, of course that's not true, but they considered a prophet, and that he died by the Temple Mount, the whole purpose of the creation of Islam was to bind the Arabs as a religious obligation to hold the land of Israel. That's right. The creation of Islam, just like the creation of Christianity, God created Christianity to serve as a substitute, a surrogate kingdom of priests, so that since the Jews could not do this because of the enmity they had for each other, and therefore God gave this job over to Esau, the brother of Yitzhak. And therefore the Christians became the surrogate kingdom of priests. So also the Arabs, or the children of Ishmael, became the surrogate Jews who now claim the land of Israel. And what entitles them to that? Well, just like Christianity entitles the Christian to become the new Jew, the person who takes over the role of a Jew to macabre the whole world to God, in this case, to the worship of Jesus. So the Arabs believe that the religion of Islam entitles them to own, to possess the land of Israel, because Muhammad went up to heaven from the Temple Mount. So we begin to understand the origin, the true spiritual origin of what? Of the religion of Islam. And therefore that constitutes the golus. That constitutes the golus of Eretz Yisrael. The fact that there is a country on that land who believes that he belongs on that land. He's not there because he simply conquered the land of Israel. He's there because he belongs to the land spiritually. The death of his prophet, Muhammad, who died in the Temple Mount and went up to heaven, entitles him to become the new Yerush, the one who inherits the land of Israel. So therefore, there's another claimant. Just like the Christians claim that they are the new Jew, that's right, they are the new Jew, and they have the new Torah, called the New Testament, and therefore they have the right to go around the world and convert the world to Christianity. So the Arab also claims to be the new Jew. That's right. Fundamentally, the attachment of the Arab to the land of Israel, by virtue of the death of his prophet, entitles them to be a Jew. That's what a Jew is. A Jew is connected to the land of Israel. Who says that? Well, that's the Torah. That's the Torah Moshe, and so on. Torah Moshe says that God promised the land of Israel to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Avram, Yitzhak, and Yaakov. So the Jew is not only a religious figure, the Jew is also a national figure. He's a people of a land that was given to him by God. So therefore, when the Arabs occupy the land of Israel, they don't simply appear as an occupier, as a tyrannical nation. They don't. They consider them spiritually worthy of being the new Jew. But they are the new Jew because they also go around the world and convert the world to Islam. So both Christianity, who claims to be a Jew, the new Jew is the Christian, and both Islam, which is the new Jew by virtue of what? The Quran, by virtue of that, what they consider their Torah. In other words, both religions are fundamental to Judaism. That's why it's called Judeo-Christian and Judeo-Islam. Both religions, those religions, come from Judaism. But they not only come from Judaism, in their belief, it has replaced Judaism. They have replaced Judaism and taken over the role of Judaism, which is the function of Judaism was to make a Mamlechus Kahanim, so it would convert the world to the knowledge of God. But who's doing that today? They are. Who is converting all the nations of the world, the Goyim, to the idea of God? Well, the Christians, to the idea of Christianity. And who else? The Muslims, to the idea of Islam. So therefore, both of these nations have become a surrogate Jew. That's right. Esau, the spiritual source of Christianity, and Ishmael, the spiritual source of Islam. Both were the children of Abraham and Yitzhak. So they are the brothers. They are half-brothers or brother. Esau was a brother to Yaakov, and Ishmael was a half-brother. But these are our brothers. And they maintain that they have taken over the concept of Mamlech Kahanim, a surrogate of priests. And they bring to the world the knowledge of God. And therefore most of the world is composed of who? Of Christians and Muslims. So this is not a simple matter. Both Christianity and Islam were created as surrogates, as substitutes for the Jewish people who lost the schus of becoming a Mamlech Kahanim, a kingdom of priests. And they have taken over because they believe that they have been given this role now. The Arabs believe that Muhammad has taken the place of Moshe. Whereas Moshe Rabbeinu is the greatest of all prophets, they don't believe that. They believe that Muhammad is the greatest of all prophets. And therefore he has replaced Moshe Rabbeinu as the ultimate prophet. And therefore, by replacing Moshe Rabbeinu and by replacing the Torah with the Quran, they have created a new Jew. And they do what the Jews are supposed to do, convert the world to the emes of the existence of God. And therefore, they are attached to the land of Israel. Through what? Through the ascent of Muhammad to heaven. So we see, therefore, what God is doing. That God has made the last 2,000 years, and created two surrogate Mamlech Kahanim to replace the Jews, because the Jews have lost that schus, because they have such contempt for each other. So that's what we mean by the exile of the land of Israel. All the critical features of Judaism are now given over to the Goyim. Goyim, who were once originally our brothers, the Goyim of Ishmael and the Goyim of Esau, and they have taken over our role. So this is very, very critical. Now, when we say that the Arabs have taken over the land of Israel, what is the history of that? Well, Islam was really created in the 6th century ACE. That's right. That's when Muhammad lived. And Muhammad was able to conquer all the Arabian countries, starting from the Arabian Peninsula of Saudi Arabia, and then he conquered Eretz Yisrael and all the Arabian countries, the whole Middle East. And he even, the Christians, the Muslims, not only conquered the Middle East, but they conquered parts of Europe and so on. And then they went into a second phase. The first phase was composed of Arabs themselves. The critical ones who created the religion of Islam were of Arab ethnicity. But the ones who maintained Islam and became rulers of the whole world were the Ottoman Turks, who are not Arab. The Ottoman Turks are a Central Asian people, and so on. It's called a Turkish ethnic group. And the Ottoman Turks conquered the world. They conquered a large part of the world besides the Christians and so on. And these two religions, Christianity and Islam, dominated the world. It fundamentally dominated the world at that time. So in the 6th century, in the time of Muhammad, he developed Islam. But then Islam continued through the Arab, through the caliphs and the pashas and so on and so forth, and so on, and conquered the Middle East. And they eventually conquered all of Eretz Yisrael in the Crusades. And the function of the Crusades in the 11th century and 12th century and so on was to recapture the land of Israel from the Arabs by the Christians. The Christians considered sacrilege that Islam should hold the land of Israel, which was the birthplace of Jesus. So they initiated a campaign of war, and then they brought many people down to the Eretz Yisrael to fight the Arabs. Like, for example, under Saladin, the great Arab general. Actually, the Saladin was actually a Kurd. But they fought the Arabs under the Crusades, and there was a couple of Crusades, and there were many Jews that were killed along the way of Christians going to Eretz Yisrael from Europe. So it was a terrible time. It was a terrible time for the Jewish people in the fact of what they suffered. But Islam really moved from the Middle East under an Arab domination. Islam became the main religion to Turkey, to the Ottoman Turks. And it was the Ottoman Turks who really ruled the whole Middle East. And they ruled the whole Middle East, and they ruled the land of Israel also, because Eretz Yisrael was in their golus, in their exile. Until when? When was the rule of Ishmael, or the exile of Ishmael, start to disappear? So this actually happened in the 20th century. At the end of World War I, World War I was a war between, not only in Europe, between Germany and all of Europe, but World War I also included the nations of the Ottoman Turks. The Ottoman Turks were one of the allies of Germany, and therefore they fought against the British and against the Americans in the Middle East. And then after World War I, the Ottoman Turks lost. Now, they were the main Islamic nation that controlled the land of Israel and were chiefly responsible for its position of exile. That's right. But when they lost World War I, they lost their ability to dominate the world at that time. The Ottoman Turks lost their power, and Muslims lost their power. And their power suddenly went over to Europe, to England, to France, and so on and so forth. So that we began to see a certain transition, that the land of Israel would begin to leave exile. That's right. The first one that really left exile of the three components, the Jew, the Tayag Mitzvahs, and Eretz Yisrael, the first one that would start to leave the status of exile was Eretz Yisrael. Because until World War I, Eretz Yisrael was ruled by the Muslims. And these Muslims were fundamentally the Ottoman Turks. But after World War I, the Ottoman Turks lost the war, and the British took over the control of the land of Israel. No longer was Israel controlled by Muslims, and this is an extremely important thing, because this constituted the beginning of the end of the exile of the Mashiach. The 20th century is the beginning of the end of the exile of the Mashiach. But this end would happen in stages. It would first happen to the land of Israel. Next it would happen to the Jew. And the final stage, it would happen to the Taryag Mitzvahs. So this is the sequence of the Geula. The Geula represents, what does the word Geula mean? The word Geula means a redemption. A redemption from what? A redemption from exile. And this Geula was of all three components: Yisrael, the Taryag Mitzvahs, and Eretz Yisrael. And these three components would gradually leave the redemption, would be redeemed, and it would leave exile in a certain sequence. And that sequence, first, Eretz Yisrael. Eretz Yisrael would begin to go out of Golus. That's right. The next ones that will go out of Golus is the Jew, Yisrael, the concept of a Jew. And finally, the last thing that would leave the Golus of the Mashiach would be the Taryag Mitzvahs, the Torah itself. And how that would happen is a very deep mystery, which I will speak on later on. So how did Eretz Yisrael begin to lose its status of exile? Well, in some way, the status of the Ottoman Turks as the rulers of Israel would have to change. And that changed after World War I. Not only that, it changed even before the end of that. Because in 1917, Britain developed a certain doctrine called the Balfour Declaration, which Britain admitted that the land of Israel has to return to the Jews. That's right. Britain was the first country that recognized Israel as the true owners of the land of Israel, that they were in the land of the Israel biblically, and that they owned the land of Israel now. So England was the first country that began to redeem the land of Israel from its exile from the Muslims. The Balfour Declaration was the first true recognition by the Goyim, by a Goyish nation, by a Gentile nation, that the Jews are the real owners of the land of Israel. And the Balfour Declaration said that now that England controls the land of Israel and fundamentally some of the countries in the Middle East, England declared that it is the Jew who will return to Israel. England gives over the land of Israel to the Jews, who were the original owner. So that Balfour Declaration was the first instance when a Gentile nation, the Goyim, England, recognizes the redemption of Eretz Yisrael. And that constitutes the beginning of the end of the exile. But it would have to go in stages and so on. So therefore, England was given the mandate by the League of Nations that they would be responsible to use the Balfour Declaration to make it operational. But gradually, what happened was, right after World War I, England was supposed to give the sovereignty of Eretz Yisrael back to the Jews, but instead they negotiated with the Arabs and so on and so forth, and they allowed the Arabs to live in the land of Israel. So they betrayed their fundamental Balfour Declarations. They betrayed the meaning of the Balfour Declarations, and they recanted on what they felt was to give Israel back to the Jews, the land of Israel. So in other words, it would not be an easy thing for the land of Israel to be redeemed. This would be much harder than we thought. Even though England acknowledged the ownership of the land of Israel by the Jews, it would be many, many years until after World War II in 1948, where the Jews would actually be able to acquire the land of Israel. And for the next 30 years, it was a process of the Jews attempting to acquire the land of Israel in some way from the Arabs. But the Arabs maintained a steady habitation in the land of Israel. The Arabs refused to leave totally. They did not respect the Balfour Declaration, and they did not respect England's ability to write such a document. And the Arabs to this day are in the land of Israel. But they're not in the land of Israel because Israel, fundamentally, Israel is still in exile. The fact is, as long as there are Arabs who occupy the land of Israel, so therefore it's still in exile. But it is not the same exile that happened before. The fact that the Arabs are still in the land of Israel is not truly a function of the Arab domination on the exile of Israel. No, it looks like that. It looks like the fact that the Arabs have the Temple Mount, and the Arabs have Hebron, the Moras HaMachpelah, the Cave of Machpelah. The Arabs have all the Mekoimos HaKadoshim, the holy places with the Jewish people, and the Arabs control it, right? So it looks like the Arabs are still in control of what? Of the holy places of the land of Israel. But that only will look like it. The real Golus of Eretz Yisrael is no longer the Golus of Ishmael. That is only an apparent Golus. It looks like it's the Golus. So if Israel is not in the Golus is not in the Golus of the Arab nations, and that seems to be only apparent, who is the Golus of Eretz Yisrael? What does that mean? The Arabs look like they control all the Mekoimos Kadoshim, and they live. There are a lot of Arabs in the land of Israel. I think it's 1/5 of the population. So it seems to be a remnant of the Golus of Eretz Yisrael. So what do I mean that we are not in the Golus of Ishmael? Who are we in the Golus then? And the answer to that is the Erev Rav. And I will explain that later on. We are now in the Golus of the Erev Rav. Who is the Erev Rav? These are Jews themselves. That's right. It's a new category of Jew called the Erev Rav. And we are in the Golus of the Erev Rav who support the Arabs, who allow the Arabs to hold us, to hold the Mekoimos HaKadoshim, and they allow it. In other words, if they did not allow it, they throw all the Arabs out. The Golus is controlled by the concept of power. Whatever nation has the power through the death penalty is considered an exile. A true exile is a land which has power. It has the power of life and death. You see it. And the ones who have the power of life and death in Israel are not the Arabs. So even though the Arabs occupied the Mekoimos HaKadoshim in a certain part of Eretz Israel, they don't have the power because they don't have the power even to remain in Eretz Israel. They have a temporary residence. That's right. After World War I, the Arabs are now in residence in Israel temporarily. So who has the power of whether you can reside in Israel? And the answer is the Erev Rav. The power of life and death lies with the Erev Rav. And therefore Eretz Yisrael has moved from one Golus to another. It has moved from the Golus of Ishmael, from the Golus of the Arabs, in which it was in Golus for over 1,000 years, and it's become moved into the Golus of who? Of the Zionists, the Golus of the Erev Rav. And this needs a completely different share to explain this whole concept. You see it. What do I mean by this, and so on and so forth. So therefore we see that Israel has left its original exile. And this original exile was the land of Islam, was the Muslim religion, was the Arabs and the Ottoman Turks. And when they controlled the land of Israel for the last 1,400 years, Israel was truly occupied by Islam. It's important to make this distinction. The Golus of Israel is defined by Islam. It was not defined by the Arabs. The Arabs are attached to the land of Israel through the Islamic religion, through the belief that Muhammad went to heaven through the Temple Mount. That's the glue that connects the Arab to the land of Israel, because in that glue, he maintains that he has the ownership of the land of Israel. So this is what it is. And this exile of the land of Israel through Islam, which is its center, has finally ended at the end of World War I, when the Ottoman Turks lost to the British in World War I. And the land of Israel was given over to the Europeans, to the British, to the French, and so on and so forth, and so on. So therefore, the land of Israel is no longer in the original exile of what it once was. It was no longer controlled by the power of the Ottoman Turks or the power of the Arabs. And that was the true exile. And it was no longer controlled by their belief that they own the land of Israel, that they are the new Jew. The land of Israel is now controlled, how? By a different nation. And who is that? A Jewish nation, which is called the category of the Erevav, which I will explain. So therefore we see that the land of Israel is the first component of the three components of the Jewish people that now has begun to witness its resurrection, its redemption. And from World War I until now, we have been involved in the process of redeeming Eretz Yisrael, not from the Arabs, because that can happen at any moment, but we have to redeem Eretz Yisrael from the Erevav. So therefore, this requires a completely new and a completely distinct discussion. The exile of the land of Israel, the third component of the Jewish people, is over. And that exile has been transformed from the exile of the Arabs and the Ottoman Turks and Islam to the exile of the Erevav. And this starts the Gula. This is the actual beginning of the appearance of the redemption. And I will have to speak about this next time and clarify in terms of what exactly I'm talking about. And then I will have to talk about the Golus of the Erevav. Because without understanding the concept of the Erevav and why the Erevav is in control of Israel and what gives them that power, why does God allow them to control Israel and to control the destiny of Klal Yisrael? And why are they a part of the exile? That has to be discussed next time itself. Okay. Are there any questions?
It would seem that the Arabs have like a dual purpose. They first do what Christians do, somehow claiming that they take over the prophet Moshe, and they're the chosen people. But then, additionally to that, they take over the function of a relationship with Eretz Yisrael, versus the Christians only have one function.
Right. What you're saying is correct. The function of both the Christians and the Muslims, their function is fundamentally to be responsible for the exile of the concept of the Mamlechet Kohanim, and so that's mainly the Christians. The Christians were basically the nation that was most responsible for being the substitute or the surrogate Mamlechet Kohanim. The Arabs also have that function, you see it. They have that function as well. They are the Mamlechet Kohanim, and they have influenced many, many billions of people on the planet Earth. So both the Christians and the Muslims, both the descendants of Esau and the descendants of Ishmael, have that function. But you could ask, why do they have that function? Why was this function to be a surrogate Mamlechet Kohanim given to those two peoples, the children of Esau, and the children of Ishmael? And the answer is, and I've never seen really a discussion of the answer, but I believe that the answer is this, because what was the function of Esau? Who was Esau? Esau was the brother of Yitzhak, right? But Esau was originally supposed to be a tzaddik, like his brother Yaakov. His function was to redeem Klal Yisrael to a certain kedusha, a certain tahara. The job of Esau was to be responsible for the tahara of the Jewish people. He was born with a certain Yitzhak, which was very powerful. And he was born with that Yitzhak because he had the ability to contest that Yitzhak and become a tzaddik. That was supposed to be the function of Yitzhak. I mean, of Esau. That's right. He was the twin of Yaakov, and as a twin, he had a function similar to Mashiach ben Yosef, where he had to conduct himself in the concept of tahara, and therefore he was supposed to be a tzaddik, bringing the tahara of the bria to its function itself, and Yitzhak knew that. So therefore, he had one function of tahara, the tahara of Zoyama, the tahara of the Yitzhak in its fundamental evil sense, and he's supposed to rectify this concept of the evil of Zoma, the evil of sins through the concept of Zoma, and he was supposed to be a tzaddik, but he failed to be a tzaddik. Instead, he became a rasha. So therefore, Esau subverted his whole tachlis. Instead of being a tzaddik and being responsible for the aliyah, the ascent of the Jewish people, he was responsible for the descent of the Jewish people, because he became a very big rasha. Now, at the same time, therefore, he was entitled to become a Malach Kohanim if the Jews would lose that. So Yitzhak said this about Esau, that you were supposed to be a tzaddik. You're supposed to be the partner of Yaakov. You were supposed to be matar, to purify the world from the nature of Zoma, but you didn't. You became a rasha. But you did not lose your tachlis to become a global leader. In other words, Yitzhak said, I have two sons, Yaakov and Esau, and both sons have the capacity to be a global leader, each one in a different way. But Esau also had that capacity. But when Esau became a rasha, he only lost his ability to matahar, to perform a certain function, but he did not lose his title as a global leader. Because Yitzhak said, Ayodayim is the Esau, that Esau, the descendants of Esau, would eventually rule the earth if the descendants of Yaakov have sinas chinam and can't function. So if Yaakov fails to become a kingdom of priests, Esau will become the kingdom of priests. So on a certain level, the global destiny of both sons remained, even though Esau became a rasha. So that's why he became the surrogate of Yaakov, because Yaakov failed because of sinas chinam. So Esau took up that role as a surrogate. Now the same thing with Ishmael. That's right. What does it mean that Ishmael became a son of Avraham Avinu? Ishmael was the son of Avraham Avinu through Hagar, she was a Pelegesh, through his maidservant. And the concept is, no one really ever talks about Ishmael. What was the purpose of Ishmael? What was the purpose? Anyone who would be the son of Avraham Avinu would have a certain Kedusha. So Ishmael also had a Kedusha, obviously, because he was the son of Avraham Avinu. So the question that we have to ask is, what was the purpose of Ishmael as a son of Avraham Avinu? And I've never seen the answer to this, but I'm sure it must be stated. Because I believe that that just like Yitzhak had two sons, Esau and Yaakov, Avraham Avinu also had two sons. Who? Yitzhak and Ishmael. And what was the purpose of Ishmael? The purpose of Ishmael,
monotheism, just like his father.
The purpose of Ishmael was to be an assistant to Yitzhak. Yitzhak was supposed to go out among the nations of the world and carve the nations of the world to Torah. Yitzhak was the beginning of the tachlis of Klal Yisrael, not Avraham. Even though Avraham he Judaized many goyim and he taught them about God, it was through Yitzhak that really was supposed to be completed, or at least started in a major scale. So the function of Yitzhak was to become a mamlach, really a goy kodesh and a mamlach kahanim. That function really was supposed to start with Yitzhak. But that function was supposed to be supported by Ishmael. In other words, Yitzhak and Ishmael were both supposed to be Makarav, the Umas Olam, the nations of the world. That's right. The function of Ishmael was not to produce an enemy of the Jews. That was not his function. He was supposed to assist Yitzhak in being Makarav, in bringing the world closer to God, and so on. So Yitzhak would be able to teach the Torah to the Goyim and to all of mankind. And Yishmael would actually go out and Makarav mankind to the Torah. So in a certain way, Yishmael had a holy function. Yishmael was supposed to be a tzaddik. That's right. But Yishmael did not become a tzaddik. He failed. He became jealous of Yitzhak. He became jealous of Yitzhak's role. He was jealous of Yitzhak's role as what? As the Novi who would Mekav, Klal Yisrael, and the Umas Olam all to the Torah and to God. And Yishmael became jealous that the central role of Kiruv was supposed to be given to Yitzhak. And he was supposed to give a secondary role to support Yitzhak. And he was jealous of him, and therefore he tried to kill him many times. And that's why Sarah told Avraham Avinu to put Hagar into exile, to throw her out of the house and let her go, because Ishmael was a danger to the life of Yitzhak. So Ishmael, therefore, was very similar to Esau. Just like Esau was supposed to be a tzaddik and Makav the Bria to Tahara, but instead Esau became a Rasha, so therefore he became the surrogate Mamresh Kohanim when the Jews failed. So Ishmael is supposed to be what? A tzaddik, and assist Yitzhak in being Makar of the world, in bringing the world closer to God. Instead, Ishmael failed. He failed because he became a Rasha and he tried to kill Yitzhak. So therefore, as a Rasha, he now became the father to Islam. He became the father to the Arab people or something like that, so who would initiate Islam to become another surrogate nation of Mamresh Kohanim. Just like Esau, through Christianity, became a surrogate Mamresh Kohanim, kingdom of priests, so Ishmael became a surrogate Mamlech Kohanim to the Jew. So therefore, both the Christians and the Muslims both think that they have taken over the Jew. They both believe that they are the new Jew. And both lay claim to Eretz Yisrael. And this is it. Why? Because they became Rishoyim. So God moved them then in terms of their global destiny. He removed from them their original destiny, that they should be a tzaddik, and he gave them their global destiny as Rishoyim. But nevertheless, he gave them a destiny to be a Mamlech Kohanim. They would take over the Jews temporarily when the Yemos Mashiach would go into Golus. So therefore, this is much deeper than we realize. The story of Ishmael and the story of Esau is not simply a story of two people who became Rishoyim. It is a story of two people who should have been tzaddikim and should have been partners to Yitzhak and Yaakov. In what? In being a nation of priests, in being Makar of all the nations of the world. That was their original tachlis. But both of them became Rishoyim, and therefore they were both given b'diavad. It's indirectly they were both a position to become a surrogate Mamlech Kohanim, a surrogate kingdom of priests, who thought in both cases they would be the new Jew. So that's why they're so wrapped up with Klal Yisrael. Why are the Jews so connected to Christians and so connected to Muslims? Why aren't the Jews connected to what? To the Far East, to Asia, to the Chinese, to the Southeast Asians? Why aren't the Jews connected to those religions? Why aren't the Jews connected to Hinduism and to Buddhism and to Taoism? And, why? Why are the Jews fundamentally throughout their history only connected to Christianity and only connected to Islam? And the answer is because both Islam and Christianity became the surrogate Mamlech Kohanim instead of the Jews. And why those two people? Because those two people really were supposed to be tzaddikim in the end. Ishmael and Esau were supposed to be tzaddikim, and they were supposed to assist Yitzhak and Yaakov to be makar the world to the knowledge of God as the waters cover the sea. So therefore you see that there's a program here. There's an incredible program that nobody seems to notice. That the reason why the Jews are so connected to Christians and to Islam, in the sense that the exile of the Jewish people is in Islam and is in Christianity. The fundamental exile of the Jews globally is in the nations which are Christian and in the nations which are Muslim. Why? Because those two nations were originally supposed to be tzaddikim. They were two nations that were supposed to assist the Jew in their ultimate tachlis to bring a tikkun to the world and make the world into Olam Haba. Do you understand this? That's why the Jews were never exiled. They were never exiled in the Far East, in China, in Southeast Asia, in India. They were never exiled in what? As a totality in India. And therefore, they had never had anything to do with Hinduism. They were never exiled in China, except very small amounts in Kaifeng and so on. The Jews were never exiled to China en masse because they have no connection to these nations. These remain true Goyish nations. So the only nations that they became connected to are nations which have a certain level of Kedusha. That's right. Christianity has a certain level of Kedusha that entitles it to be the Mamlechus Kohanim that the Jews once were. Islam has a certain Kedusha that entitles it to be the Mamlechus Kohanim of the Goyish world. So Islam and Christianity are not simply two religions that appeared on the earth. Both of those religions appeared as a result of Judaism. They both come from Judaism because in the end they both have to replace Judaism if Yitzhak and Yaakov fail to somehow accomplish their mission. If the Jews fail to be the kingdom of priests, the Mamlechus Kohanim, so then their brothers then become the Mamlechus Kohanim. And even though their brothers both became Rishoyim, Ishmael and Esau, nevertheless, they retain their global destiny, and they have enough of a Kedusha left in the Klippas. Their Kedusha is in the Klippas to become what? To become a Mamlechus Kohanim of the world. So therefore we see, in a certain sense, the structure of human history, that human history is not simply a random sequence of events that happen for no reason at all. It's distinctly controlled and directed by God to accomplish the ultimate purpose of God, which is what? Was that they should recognize God as the waters cover the sea. And therefore the destiny of the Jewish people is intimately connected to the destiny of Islam and Christianity. But it's connected through the Klippas. It's connected through the Satan. Because Ishmael and Esau begin to act in a way through their global destiny to makar the goyim of the world, because the Jews have lost that status because of their hatred and their contempt for each other.
But is there a reason why Ishmael is more connected to Eretz Yisrael than Esau?
No, Ishmael was assigned the task. It has two tasks. Islam. The two tasks of Islam is number one, to makar the world to know God, because Islam does believe in God and Allah, and it therefore does have that task of a Mamlechus Kohanim. But it was also had the task of what? Of being connected to the Golus of Eretz Yisrael. Now, I can't tell you why. It's difficult to know why that is. But they were given the task. Christianity, on the other hand, was given the task of becoming a Mamlechus Kohanim, to becoming a surrogate Mamlechus Kohanim, to bring the knowledge of God to the world, although that knowledge was in the form of Avodah Zorah, but it was a much greater knowledge than was original in paganism by idol worship. Now, why did God distribute those two? Why did God distribute those two functions? Why did God distribute those two functions to Ishmael and to Esau in that way? I don't have a clear answer to that, but I do recognize clearly that these are the two nations that are descended from our brothers, our half-brother Ishmael and our true brother Esau, so that they would take over for the Jewish people when the Jewish people failed. That I do know. So therefore, the world is composed of three peoples, ethnically. Who is that? First of all, the world is composed of Jews. These are the people who are the gatekeepers of Olam Haba. They are the ones through the Torah and the mitzvahs that eventually will create Olam Haba. The second category of humanity are the surrogate nations of Mamlech Anam, the Muslims and the Christians. They are a higher level of Kedusha than the rest of the Goyim, even though they are Goyim too, but they have a higher level of Kedusha because they have the role of surrogate Mamlech Anam, surrogate kingdom of priests. And it is their fundamental purpose to distribute the knowledge of the Torah to the Ummos Olam, to the nations of the world, instead of the Jews. And then there's the third category of Goyim, and that's the nations of the world on the lower level. There are 70 madregas of the nations of the world, and the highest of those madregas of Goyim are Christians and Muslims, and the lowest madrega of Goyim on that world, on that list of 70 nations, are what? Are the nations of China and India and the South Pacific and so on and so forth. But even the Christians were able to Christianize the world, and the Muslims are Islamicize the world, because the Muslims are working through Africa and through a great part of the world, the Middle East, to bring the knowledge of God to them. And the Christians are working to the Far East, to India, to China, and so on, to bring the knowledge of God to them. So slowly, these two nations, Ishmael and Esau, the Arab nations and so on, and the Christian nations, are bringing the knowledge of God to all of mankind. But if you look at mankind in terms of their purpose, you see that there are three distinct components: the Jew, the Christian and Muslim, and finally the regular Goy, who does not have any of those functions and so on, and he will simply be a recipient as a Zolosoi, and he will also eventually go to Olam Haba and certain things and certain destiny that God puts them through. But there are three distinct nations, categories of nations in the world: the Jew, the surrogate Mamlech Kahanim of Islam and Christianity, and finally the true God who will eventually become a Zolosoi also. So from this whole history, you can begin to see how God is running the world and where he is leading it to. Where is he leading it to? To the end. The Geula. And what is that? It's where the Jews become Jews again, and they become the fundamental kingdom of priests, and the Goyim retract their surrogate religions of Islam and Christianity, and they all become B'nai Noach. And then finally, the nations of the world itself, the Chinese and the Indians and so on, and they become B'nai Noach too, and they retract on their Avodah Zorah or Naminist. So the world is dominated by three species of mankind in terms of the relationship as a Zulosoi to earn Olam Haba. So I think this will allow you to see things much more clearly and how human history is distributed. Are there any more questions?
To Yitzhak's point, Yitzhak said that.
What's that?
I had a question. To the point made earlier that it seemed as though the Islam had a dual role. Mamlechas Kohanim and Eretz Yisrael, whereas the Christians only had the one role of Mamlechas Kohanim. But the Christian role really addresses the specific of the mitzvahs, Ahavta Lecha Kamocha and the Ahavta Hashem Elkecha. So they really more so than Islam. And so
in a certain sense,
their role of Mamlechas Kohanim is much greater in that way, in addressing specific mitzvahs.
I would agree with you, because the essence of the Christian religion is love of God and love of man, even though they have no way of observing that. They are total hypocrites in terms of, if you look at Christian history, they are incredible hypocrites, in this whole thing. But at least theoretically, they maintain that this is the truth. Whereas Islam, Islam is mostly a religion bein adam lamakom, between man and God. And their behavior to man himself is what the Torah calls pera adam. They're really a very bad people morally in the way they treat each other, and so on. But, for that you'd have to go into the details of the destiny of these two nations, and that's not the purpose of these lectures. But at least you see the pattern. At least I have demonstrated the patterns. There are patterns that exist and patterns that go on between these three components of mankind. And all of human history follows these patterns.
I believe there's a Zohar. My memory serves me right, that the Chusar Mila of Ishmael is why he has that Yisrael. He has the Mila without Priya, so he gets that Yisrael when it's not in its beauty. So that would answer.
Okay. Well, we don't really have a clear answer yet, I don't believe, because we don't really have a clarity of Ishmael or Esau. We have a bigger clarity on Esau than Ishmael. But we need a much greater clarity to truly understand the destiny of Islam and the destiny of Christianity, and why each one has the specific role that it has in human history. But eventually, with the help of God, we'll get there.
Amen.
How do you explain, Rabbi, how do you explain why in Muslim lands there wasn't as much, holocausts and pogroms and things as there were in Christian lands?
Because the Jewish religion does not contradict. You see, there's a difference between the Jews vis-a-vis the Christians and the Jews vis-a-vis the Muslims. Jews vis-a-vis the Muslims is not really a contradiction. Muhammad says that he was a prophet. Muhammad never claimed to be God. So therefore, Islam is not really avodah zarah. They believed in one God, like Allah. And even in the period of the philosophers, in the medieval times, with Avicenna, Averroes, the very famous Greek philosophers, even the Rambam, when he wrote the Monavuchim, really followed some of the Arabian philosophers. There was a philosopher called Averroes, who was one of the greatest of all the Muslim philosophers, and Avicenna, also another one. So even the Rambam was much closer to the Arabs from Islam than he was to Christianity. Judaism doesn't present a direct confrontation with Islam, because there's only a machlekes between the prophets. The Jews maintain that the Ikka prophet was Moshe, and the Muslim maintain that the Ikka prophet is what? Was Muhammad. But that's not an essential really machlekes. But with the Christians, it's different. The Jews maintain that Jesus is not God. That is avodah zarah. So the confrontation that Jews have with Christianity is fundamental. The Jews reject Christianity on a fundamental level, that Christianity, as far as the Jew is concerned, is considered idol worship. Now that's a very serious charge. The Jews do not consider Islam idol worship. In fact, I think the Rambam says, I'm not sure, I have to look at this, but the Rambam says that if a Jew converts to Islam, that's not true avodah zarah. Because the fact that he believes that Muhammad was a real prophet is that's not the necessity of avodah zarah. I mean, there is an Indian that the Jew no longer believes in Torah. So there's a certain concept of apikos and so on and so on. But you don't have the issue of avodah zarah does not exist between Judaism and Islam, but it does exist between Christianity and Judaism. And therefore the Christians hate the Jews much more than the Muslims, because the Jews literally present a counterforce to Christianity at its very foundation. So that's why the Christians hate Jews, because they don't accept Christianity even a slight amount. Christianity is considered to be an avodah zarah, paganism, idol worship.
Well,
that's why the Christians have a much deeper. That's why the Christians have a much deeper anti-Semitism than the Jews. Does that answer?
Well, that's the theological mechanism. So I'm wondering about sinas chinam. Would it be fair to say that there was less sinas chinam among Jews living in Arab lands than there was among Jews living in Christian lands?
No, look, I never measured the sinas chinam, because the Jews in both lands had sinas chinam, or else they wouldn't be in Golus. There's a reason why the Jews are in Golus. There's a reason why the Jews in the Middle East are in Golus, and why the Jews in Europe are in Golus. And both have to do with sinas chinam. Now, you want to measure and compare that? Okay, I mean, you can try. You'd have to do that properly. You'd have to truly examine the historical evidence to support this. But they're both sections of Klal Yisrael, the Sfardim and the Ashkenazim, both were transgressed seriously by Nadam V'Chavero.
They said there was less talking in shul by the Sfardim. Once heard that.
Yes, in a certain sense, the Sfardim have a deeper sense of Amunah than the Ashkenazim, and that's one reason why the Holocaust never happened to the Sfardim. The Holocaust really overrode the Sfardim. You know, it nearly happened to them when Rama was heading to Israel, but they never got there. So the Jews of Eretz Yisrael and the Jews of Egypt and all the Arab countries never really had the Holocaust like the European Jews, because there's something about the European Jews that was a greater chutzpah than the Sephardic Jews. But that discussion is needs to be talked about at a different time.
Yeah. You also see a difference between the klipa of Yishmael. Yishmael did tshuva. Yishmael doesn't have a concept of Amalek.
Right. There's one thing that I did not mention, and I will mention now. Yishmael, in the quote to the Torah says that Yishmael actually did tshuva. He regretted his hatred of Yitzhak, because the Torah learns out. You learn out that Yishmael allowed Yitzhak to go first, and when Avraham Avinu died, so the Torah they learn out. I think Azal, I don't remember where it is, but they learn out that Yishmael does tshuva, and that will be the destiny in the end. In the end, the Muslims will do tshuva to Klal Yisrael, you know, which I don't know will be true of the Christians itself. It will happen in a different way. But there is the fact that Yishmael does tshuva, and this affects his influence on Islam and all the Arab peoples. Okay, I thank you all for appearing. In 2 weeks we will have another share, and so on. And we will speak about this time. We will speak about the Geula in a certain sense, the Geula as it's beginning to appear, because with the Golus of Eretz Yisrael, we are now beginning to see the Geula of Eretz Yisrael. That is the first component of Klal Yisrael that is being redeemed, and that is Eretz Yisrael. The next component which is being redeemed is the concept of Jews, Yisrael, and that's also being redeemed as the Jews move back to Israel and so on and so forth. And the final component that has to be redeemed is the Tayag Mitzvahs, or the Torah. That still is in terrible gullus. Not only because most Jews don't learn Torah anymore, and most Jews are apikosim, literally, they don't believe in Torah and Sinai, but even in the Frum world, in the Orthodox world, the Torah of the Yeshiva world is in terrible gullus also, and I will explain this later on.